All right, let's get started. Welcome, one and all, to the seminar that I've titled A Bend in the Road, Why Advocacy Matters. My name is Alex Bender. I'm a director of quality engineering and have been working in software QA for a number of years. But there's recently I've wanted to take a pivot into advocacy, what it means, and building systems of advocacy. And the start of that conversation is what I want to explore here tonight with all of you. So why don't we get started and talk to about our event. I'll talk, and then I'll let our presenters talk around their areas of expertise. So as we see on the agenda here, I'll talk about this, give some, a welcome speech, and then Donna Cook will talk, Julie and Hannah will talk, and then Molly, Roberto, and Snake. So what got me started here was this idea that I had where I believe that we're in a state, it's probably been that way for a while, but what have you, that I believe that the world needs more people to advocate for those in need around the topics that engage them. And so in thinking about things like in software, the evolution of waterfall to Scrum and things like this, how the systems of doing that job have changed and evolved as we learn new things, I believe that there is an underlying system to what it means to be an advocate and how to advocate for the things and the positions that we believe in. And we can then use that system to influence others to make better and more empathic decisions, both ourselves and the people around us. So again, our presenters, myself, Alex Bender, Donna Cook, Julie Bosch with Hannah Fernie, and then we have Molly Thompson, Roberto Blaine, and Snake Bloomstrine. Additionally, we have the opportunity to have some ASL interpreters for those on the live here with us in the Zoom call live, Numia and Ezra, as well as Nancy and Julie helping with the accessibility for Hannah. So I want to thank them for taking the time to provide an extra dimension of accessibility to this conversation. So moving on, what does what does advocacy look like? And a lot of people, when I talk to them about advocacy, they think it's this, right? Especially with protests and such in the news lately, they have this idea that being an advocate and that advocacy is leading a movement, is being participating in these movements, whether it's BLM or what have you, right? Which is, BLM is where this photo take comes from. But the other thing, if you look up advocacy online, like the definition of being an advocate, this is the common definition, right? It's the lawyer. It's taking your case to process through the legal system. And while that is a system, that's just one dimension, and that's already, we know, many of us have had some sort of exposure with the legal system. That's a really mired, complex system where you need specialized skills, but that really doesn't speak to society or culture as a whole. And I've found, and with working through like the Prop 8 stuff in California years ago, that sometimes advocacy looks best here at like conversations around the dinner table where you have, racist or homophobic family member that you speak out, they make some comment, you're like, hey, that's not cool, right? You don't need to be that way, right? Additionally, being out in social gatherings, you're playing ball with your friends or whatever, and they say something, and being able to push back, whether it's online or in playing ball in the park or whatever, pushing back and setting boundaries is a form of advocacy. It lets people know around you that certain types of behaviors aren't cool. They are crossing a boundary for you, and so this is where advocacy really starts playing a part in our everyday lives, not just in these big, complex political movements or court cases or things like this. Additionally, right, we see some folks where they are very vocal in their advocacy when it comes to political discourse. And it's not just necessarily looking at, Republicans, Democrats, Labor, what have you, but the process of the political system should be advocacy. It has components of advocacy in them, even if it's been, if we could argue about the corruption and the bribery and all this other stuff. That's not the point, right? The underlying system is that it is an advocacy style process. And finally, there's another part of advocacy that we'll be speaking on later, right? And this is being able to provide support and accessibility to those people who might need it. And so from this perspective, right, it's not just setting boundaries, it's not just trying to influence people, but it's also being an advocate so that that those other people or those things can have the things that they need to have an even-footed or equal access to the things that some of us might take for granted. So those are just examples of advocacy. I'm sure there's many more, but this is a way to provide a kind of like, what does advocacy, what is advocacy? And that's actually an interesting question Martin has in the chat, is how do you define advocacy, right? And so me providing these examples, right, to me, being an advocate is building that bridge. And we'll talk about that here in just a second, is being that bridge between the subject of advocacy and some target audience, right? So to me, it plays into what is the dynamics at play when you need to be an advocate or when advocacy is at play, right? That there is a subject of advocacy. And often we think about being an advocate for someone else, but it's not always that way, right? Sometimes the subject of advocacy might be the environment, or it might be space exploration, or it might be, the way the business operates. That subject could be a broader thing than just I am advocating for someone or some class of people or things along those lines. It could be other things. So rather than trying to depersonalize it or decompose it, right? I just mentioned that it's a subject, the subject of what you're advocating for. And then there's a target audience, right? That you could just yell out into the nature but who's going to receive that message, right? So in theory, you are advocating to someone or some system for someone or something or some system, right? And so what's a core dynamic at play when we're talking about this, right? One of the core pieces is empathy, right? The advocate, when I'm operating as an advocate, I need to empathize with the position of which I am trying to advocate for, right? Again, this could be a concept like the environment or space exploration or what have you. I still need to understand and empathize the needs of that system, of that subject, right? As well as I need to empathize with the audience that I am speaking towards. Because if I don't understand where they are in relation to the subject, the communication is going to miss completely, right? I need to be able to speak to the audience. And so this requires some skills regardless of the topic, right? Some topics also require specialized knowledge and things like this, but regardless of what the topic might be, if you don't have empathy for both sides of that conversation, you're never, it's not never, but it will become more challenging as time goes on to have those conversations. Additionally, I want to recognize that there is a power dynamic at play and an influence dynamic at play, right? As an advocate, I am trying to influence the audience. I'm trying to present my power in some way so that the audience might make a different decision or might act in the favor that I'm trying to advocate for. And in the case of like that conversation around the dinner table, I might have more power or influence than I realize because it's family or friends, right? Whereas in a political environment, as a lone person, I might not have as much power influence as an individual, but this is where movements come in. It's not just it's not just the power or the influence of the one individual, it's the power of the movement, and making sure that those voices are heard across the movement, right? So all of this still speaks to the advocate is someone who is doing something, who is reaching out, who plays an active part. So what's at risk to be an advocate? Well, you could do nothing, right? I could do nothing. And so therefore, if you do nothing and you stay silent, the current situation can continue. Whatever that situation is, whatever the subject of advocacy is, that situation may not change. Additionally, if that situation is bad, you may lose friends, family members, members of your community may leave you, may turn against you, all of those things because you did not advocate for them. And you could be wrong, right? History over time might prove that you were not on the right side of history for that particular topic. And that may only come after the fact, right? Here we have Elie Wiesel. He has this quote, right? We must always take sides because neutrality never helps the victim. It always helps the oppressor, right? Silence encourages the tormentor and never the tormented, right? He was a big advocate post the Holocaust around that, but taking those lessons and applying them forward. So what's the alternative, right? Instead of doing nothing, speak up. So you may speak up and nothing may change. Right? That's always a risk, right? So the situation could continue. You still might lose friends because you spoke up, right? You could be wrong and be advocating for the wrong side of things, but you believed that that's what it was. So you thought what you were doing was the right thing. Additionally, being an advocate means being a leader in some way. It requires leadership. And so a part of being a leader is becoming a target for those people who are on the other side. You were putting yourself out there for that opportunity, right? However, you also apply the possibility for change to the circumstances. Without you speaking up, who would do it? And if they're not doing it, and maybe it's not just them by themselves, you adding your voice, adding your power, your authority, your influence to that conversation could be enough or could inspire others to provide more momentum for that change, right? And then through that work, you might make somebody else's life better, right? Or a situations better, right? And as I mentioned it before, right? This is Samantha Power. She was an ambassador for the U.S. All advocacy at its core is an exercise of empathy, right? So it's empathy in motion. It's empathy being exercised in a way to influence others. So that's just a quick summary to kind of get us primed for the other presentations. And as we go into those other presentations, what are some questions that I'd like you to think about? So what does a system of advocacy look like? Like we talked about the courts, we talked about the political systems, things like this, but maybe at its core, right? What are the pieces of advocacy? What does a system of advocacy look like? That's the big question I want to try and answer, not tonight, right? Tonight's the first bit of this conversation, but in the future, over time, that's the question that I'm looking to answer, right? And in that process, self-reflection. What can I do to make better, more empathic decisions of myself? And then from that place, how can I influence others so that they do the same thing, right? So these are the questions to take into the other presentations and to think about moving forward. With that, I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation. Looking in chat, there was another question of how did I get started? And the question was how did I get started in advocacy, right? And that question, like I mentioned, I started in software, and I started a software QA as a tester. And one of the first lessons I was taught as a tester was a reminder that I am the closest to being the customer out of anybody in the engineering department. Not because I was new to the company, but because I was least exposed to the product and all of the architecture that goes into it and all of the talk about what it could do. So if something didn't work or it didn't make sense to me, I should write it up. I should write those defects. I should file those bug reports, because without that feedback, if I didn't understand it, then our customers aren't going to understand it either. And I realized at that point, that I was told at that point that I was an advocate for the customer, because software takes months or years to be created, and the cycle time for fixing those issues, if they got out, is months or years also. So at the time, right? This was in 2001. So what? So it really set me on this course where, as a customer, what can I do? Start filing bugs that aren't just functional issues, but hey, this workflow doesn't make sense, or this menuing system doesn't make sense. It could be done in a better way. Not so it wasn't just functional issues. It was also usability, color schemes for people who had color blindness, accessibility issues, things like this. So that's how I got started with the idea, and it's grown ever since. And I have over 20 years in software now, so I've seen it kind of play out in larger and larger scales and in different ways as time's gone on. So thank you for the question. And again, if there's no other questions in the chat, then we'll move on to the other presentations, and I'll talk to you at the end. Thank you.